All right. Gary's joined us. Gary, how are you this morning?
Gary's playing in a golf tournament today.
Yeah. Look at that, playing a golf tournament, but still at church. Pretty awesome, huh? So right now, Gary's got the gold star. Well, hey, at least his computer's on. All right, let's see here. All right, I think we're good. So I was concerned all week long how I was going to do this next part because chapters 8 and 9 really go together, and we don't have 3 hours on a Sunday morning to do it. Yeah. So as I was working through it, I'm like, the Lord will take me in the direction I need to go. And I only made it through verse 12 of chapter 8. So yeah, we don't have to worry about doing the whole thing. My degree in seminary was religious studies with an emphasis on Jewish history. And so when we get into this kind of stuff, this part that we're doing today is kind of like my comfort zone. It's my home plate. So I'm okay with this. And if you have any questions about it, just ask. I will give you an answer. It might not be right, but it's good stuff. Good stuff. So I told you wrong last week, and I think it stemmed from a typo that I made. When Daniel had his vision in chapter 7, it was not the first year of Nebuchadnezzar. It was the first year of Belshazzar, which is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. So this is later in Daniel's history that we're talking about. So this is a couple of years even after that we're in chapter 8. So this is Daniel's second vision, and we're going to be in chapter 8. But before we jump in there, remember, maybe you don't, that Daniel's written in 2 languages. The first part of Daniel's written in Aramaic, and then it changes gears and goes to Hebrew. So right here is where the language change happens. And so I want to talk a little bit as to why there is this language change. So Aramaic is the common language. It's the language of trade of the region. It is the native language of the Babylonians, of the Assyrians, that are all in that area. Okay, so that is the native language. So the first part of the book of Daniel was written in the common tongue. Okay, and it was meant to be heard and understood by the people in charge of the region. So it's going to be meant for the learned people. So the king, the court, and the royals, anybody else that had any kind of influence. So the first part of Daniel was written for them. Now, also, there is a structure that is built out in the book of Daniel. So starting with chapter 1, we've got an introduction, and then chapter 2 starts this kind of structure that's built as a literary device inside of the writing itself. So chapter 2 is kingdom rule. We've got 4 Gentile and 1 Jewish. Chapter 3 is tribulation and testing from Gentile power. Chapter 4 is divine deliverance by angels. Chapter 5 is divine deliverance by angels. Chapter 6 is tribulation and testing from Gentile power. Chapter 7 is back to kingdom rule, 4 Gentile and 1 Jewish. You see the structure that's going on in here? So if you look at the overview of each of these chapters, like in an outline, you can see that it's following this scheme of climbing a mountain and then coming back down the mountain. Okay, and so that's what's going on in structure of the literary form of the first part of Daniel. When we move into the second part, this is now in Hebrew, and guess what? The structure is there again, but this time it's in Hebrew. So chapter 7 starts with kingdom rule, 4 Gentile and 1 Jewish. Well, wait a minute, I thought chapter 7 was in the Aramaic. It is, but he changes language in the middle of the chapter.
7?
Yeah. And so he starts off in Aramaic, and then by the time you get to verse 26, he's shifted into Hebrew. And so part of 7 is in Aramaic, part of 7 is in Hebrew. Chapter 8, we've got tribulation and testing. Chapter 9, divine intervention. Chapter 10, divine intervention. 11, tribulation and testing. And then 12, kingdom rule. So we've got this same structure that's built into the second part of the book of Daniel. So Hebrew is the church language, the spiritual language of the Jews. And even though when they're in captivity, they don't have a synagogue to go to, they don't have a temple to go to, they still had home church. And when they had home church, they would do those services in Hebrew. So it wasn't even the common language of the Hebrew people that he was using. He's specifically using the religious language of the Jewish people here. So this is proof, other than the language, that, or a further proof other than the language, is that in the second part of Daniel's book, he uses the tetragrammaton. Do y'all remember what that is? So the name Yahweh, we spell Yahweh, Yahweh. But in Hebrew, there are no vowels. And so it's just YHWH in English. So Yahweh is the 4-letter word for God, tetra meaning 4, grammaton, word device, or a 4-letter word device. Okay. So tetragrammaton is a secret word for God, only used by the Hebrews for the Hebrews, and it's not supposed to be shared flippantly. It's not like we use the word God. We use God every place, okay? Even, oh my God. And we're not supposed to, because that's actually using the Lord's name in vain, because you're using his name for something other than what it was intended. Okay? So the tetragrammaton is further evidence that this second half of Daniel's book was for Hebrews only. It was a language that only the most learned in Babylon would know, and they wouldn't admit they knew it because it's a base language. It's lower than their language. And so they wouldn't admit to even knowing it.
God's language is lower than their language.
In their mind, because how many gods were they serving? And Jehovah God wasn't one of them, except in the case of Nebuchadnezzar and then Belshazzar. All right, so that's that. So this technique of this structure, it served a few purposes. So first of all, it provided the prophecy in the native language of the reader. So when they would see Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, or Daniel's recitation of his vision and then its meaning that Gabriel gave him, it's in the language of those who it pertained to. And so there'd be nothing lost in translation. Makes sense? Second, it provided a chiasm. So whenever you see chiasm, that's a word, we use it in chemistry, chirality. And it's this idea of if you've got your left hand and you've got your right hand, they're mirror images of each other that fit. Okay. And so they've got the same structures, but they're meant to be mirror, not opposite, but mirror. They're complementary to each other, but separate. Okay. And so this first part of Daniel is meant to be the same but different than the second part of Daniel. So it provides that chiasm. It's a way of showing different viewpoints, people to whom the prophecy was directed, and the layout of our near future, their near future, our past, and the future, which is even beyond us. It also, and this is the Holy Spirit, the way the Holy Spirit works in writing the Bible, it provided a way to ensure that no extra language got put in the book. as time went on and as translations happened. Okay. It's kind of a spell check. Okay. In computer programming, or with the way messages get conveyed from phone to phone, if someone sends you a message, the very first thing your phone receives is a number, even before the message. And that number represents a sum of all of the bits of information that's coming from the sending phone. So it gets this first 1096, and then it gets the message and it calculates the bit sum of it. And if it's 1095, it sends a message back and says, no, you sent it wrong, send it again. And the sending phone then sends it again. Your phone calculates it and says 1096, 1096. Okay, that matches. Ding, you got a message and you can read it. So all of that is happening on your computers and on your phone in the split second before the ding that you get, knowing that you got an email or a message. Okay, it's called bit sum. Well, back in the day, Hebrews wrote numbers in the columns of all of their texts. And those numbers represented the sum of the letters that was going to be in that row, actually column. But it's going to be the sum of all of those letters. And if the scribe is trying to make a copy and he gets to the bottom and he checks his sum and the sum's wrong, they tear that up and they start over. That's to make sure that there's no error. That's how we can be sure that the Bible that we have today is accurate, because they did checks all throughout history to make sure that it was copied accurately. And then when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1948, they compared those texts, which were like 1000 BC, to the texts that we have today, and they matched. They only differed, though all the entire texts only differed by one letter and a piece of punctuation. That's that jot and tittle that Jesus was talking about.
After
1,000 years. Okay, so we know that our stuff is accurate. Now, this is huge for Daniel, because the book of Daniel is one of those books that the naysayers about scripture say was faked, and it was written entirely after all the history occurred, and that's why it's so accurate to history. So the naysayers are saying that it was written after all the history unfolded in a future tense to make it sound like it's prophecy. But now we know that it's the other way around, that Daniel wrote this stuff based on what the Holy Spirit was telling him, and it was prophecy of near future events. So this is also one of the ways that we know that the prayer of Azariah, the tale of Susanna, and Bel and the dragon were later additions to the book of Daniel. They're part of what we now call the Apocrypha. They're the secret books of the Bible that the Catholic Church added in after the Protestant Reformation happened.
Is it historical?
It's historical. I'm actually going to be referring to some of it today.
Okay.
But the problem with Daniel is that these extra stories in Daniel are more cultural instead of sacred. And so folklore, yeah. So they are more, they're taken out of our Bibles because they don't belong. They weren't there in the first place. The reason we know that is when you put them in, they mess up the structure. The structure is not there anymore. And the structure was part of the original technique that Daniel used when he wrote it. Does that all make sense? Okay, so that's huge stuff there. That's part of how we got the Bible. I did a whole Sunday school lesson on that for how many weeks was that one? That was
foresight, if you call it, to keep it
Pure.
yeah. Yeah. So again, that's the Holy Spirit at work there, because the Holy Spirit knew that Daniel was going to be a contentious book. It was going to be one that people in the future were going to come against, because the prophecies in Daniel are so clear, so clean, so exact. And you don't have to stretch in order to make them fit. They fit our history, which was their near future. All right. So here we go. Daniel chapter 8, starting in verse 1. See why I wasn't going to make it through 8 and 9? So, in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. So this is after the chapter 7 vision that we already took a look at. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. Ulai Canal doesn't exist anymore. It's one of those big rivers that, because of a flood, it completely shifted and now it's desert. In the third year of Belshazzar, this is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, would make this 532 BC. And we can compare this against history to know that that's correct. So verses 1 and 2, he says that he had a vision. Okay, so I highlighted that. In verse 18, he clarifies that this vision happened while he was in a deep sleep. So it's slightly different than a dream because he has it in its entirety when he wakes up. So our dreams are fleeting. We wake up and we're like, I dreamt something about being chased by spiders. Okay, whatever it was. After the vision in 7 and 8, both, he says that he had no strength. So he wakes up after this deep sleep with this crazy vision in it, and he wakes up with no strength. And in verse 17 of chapter 8, it tells us that he had no breath. Okay, so this vision basically caused him to have night terrors or at least a panic attack. Okay, so when he woke up, this vision really messed with him. Okay, and that's why he had to write it down. Now, I've got a map here which shows what the ancient world looked like at the time. So there on the left, that lighter area is the Mediterranean Sea. It's just so that you can kind of know where you are. Down below, the bottom left corner is Egypt. We've got the Sinai Peninsula. You got your bearing? All right. So this light area going in the middle down to the lower right, that's Babylonian Empire at the time of the writing of Daniel. And then we've got the Medes, which are to the northeast. We've got Ararat, which is a country where Mount Ararat is, okay, where the ark landed. Then we've got, I know it, no laser or anything. Then we've got Arabia down to the south. So where Daniel was having this vision is at the point of this arrow here, okay? So that's where Shushan, Susa was, okay? And then Babylon's right in the middle, underlined in red. Just so that you can kind of see on the map where things are. Oh, wait, I can do that. Here, do that. There's Babylon. There's Susa. That's the Medes. They're going to be important in a little bit. Okay. Then we've got Ararat up here. We've got Arabia down here. There's Sinai, Egypt, Mediterranean Sea. Off the map here is where we go into Greece.
Is Susa still there?
There is a town there now, but it's a different name. It's an Arabic name. We hear it in the New Testament. All right. I think it was Esther too. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Thought it was Gary talking to me. It's the government or political text. All right, cool. All right, verse 3. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns. Uh-oh, more animals. Standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns were longer than the other, but it grew up later. Okay, so we got a ram with 2 horns, but one horn was longer than the other, but it became longer than the other after he saw the 2 horns.
Okay, that's
Okay, verse 4, I watched the ram as it charged toward the west and the north and the south. East got left out. No animal could stand up against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became great. So, in chapter 7, verse 5, we had a bear. Okay. And it said that the bear was raised up on one side. Kind of weird for a bear. A bear will stand up on its hind legs, but it's weird for a bear to be on its side. Well, now this is going to be a parallel to that. The ram had two horns, one raised higher than the other. So, what was the bear in chapter 7? Persia. Okay. So, if this is going to be similar, then this ram is going to have to be the same kind of thing. In verse 20, the ram is clearly identified by the angel Gabriel as the Medo-Persian Empire. He spits it out, makes it clean. And the Persians succeeded the Babylonian Empire. Okay,
The
so
bear and the ram are both Persian?
yes. So it wasn't a stretch to use the ram to represent the Medo-Persian Empire. Ammianus Marcellinus, a 4th century historian, states that the Persian ruler bore the head of a ram as he stood at the head of his army. So where I said the bear was the symbol of the government, the ram is the symbol of the military branch, the army. Okay, so it's still Persia, but now we're talking about conquering force, not a government. Okay. The ram was the national emblem of Persia after these conquests. A ram was stamped on Persian coins in later times, as well as on the headdress of later Persian emperors.
So Daniel's writing this, but this hasn't happened yet.
Correct. That's why I kept on talking about near future for them. Our past, but near future for them. Because remember, Daniel is still serving the king even when Persia takes over. So this is very near history for them. All right, so the ram is noted for the proportion of its two horns. We've got one horn higher than the other. This is an accurate prediction of the partnership between the Medes and the Persians, because the Persians were longer or larger and stronger in the partnership. And they also emerged in history after the Medes. So, and this also helps us understand this whole thing about Cyrus was actually the king of Persia, but Darius was the one in charge of Babylon when it was taken over. Is Darius the same as Cyrus? No, they were different persons. Darius was the Mede ruler. Cyrus was the Persian ruler. But as Daniel's prophecy shows, one horn grows bigger than the rest. So the Persians just end up swallowing the Medes. And the Persian king ends up being the emperor over everything. So this, and Darius is a position, right? Good remembering. Good remembering.
That's all. And Cyrus is actually.
Yeah, the king's name. Yeah, Cyrus the First, Cyrus the Great. All right. So the ram charged to the north, to the west, to the south. The Medo-Persian Empire exerted its power to the north and the south and the west. It took territory, but it made no conquests toward the east. That would be into modern day Russia. And they never pushed in that direction. They pushed north, west, and south, but they never. I don't know. Okay. Their notable wars against the Scythians were to the north, against the Greeks were to the west, and against the Egyptians were to the south. So those are the big wars in history that we can read about the Persians fighting, and they never pushed to the east. Verse 5, as I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat, another animal, a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west. It's like a unicorn goat. Crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. It came toward the two-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal, and it charged it in great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its two horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off. And in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Could you imagine waking up for a dream that you remember in detail, and you're like, what the heck was that? And this is really where Daniel was. Daniel had this vision that we get to see in chapter 7 and chapter 8. And he's like, I have no clue. God, you're going to have to give me an idea of what this is. And God sends Gabriel to him, and Gabriel sits down with him and explains it all.
The
Okay.
rams and horns and goats and.
Right.
Yeah.
So, of course, symbolism. Daniel had no idea what the symbolism was. He had just barely gotten the gold head and the silver torso and the bronze. He just got that straightened out. And now he's got 4 animals that he's got to straighten out. And now he's got more animals.
It's all future. That's the problem. There's no history for it already. This is all.
Exactly. Exactly.
Very good plot, but it already happened.
Wow.
Well, it's a
I'm
dream.
not even halfway through my slides.
Oh.
All right. So verses 21 and 22, Gabriel IDs the goat as Greece. Okay, so now this is going to fit. Greece does take over from the Medo-Persians. So, all right, so we can see that now because we're talking about our past. Its horns are identified as emperors. And from ancient history, we know this wasn't a strange symbol. The goat was a common representation of the Greek Empire. 200 years before the time of Daniel, the people that lived in the area that we now call Greece were called the goats people. So historically, it fits. The Greek Empire rose from the west of the others. It rose with unprecedented speed. And that's what this whole thing about it never touched the ground. It's kind of like a bird flying low. It swept across the earth, never touching the ground. And that's talking about how quickly the Greek Empire was built, how quickly it took over the rest of the world. The notable horn, the notable ruler was Alexander the Great. The confrontation of the goat with the ram began at the famous battle between the Persians and the Greeks, the Battle of Marathon, which is referenced in the movie 300. It's what sets up the movie, the 300. Okay. A lot of great history in that movie. Okay. So it says that the ram was powerless against it. So Persia could not stand up to any of the wars that Greece brought on them. Yes. But now we're talking about the difference between power and agility.
That's what I was gonna say.
Right. And then where the ram had 2 horns, one bigger than the other. You can't fight very well that way. And this goat had 1 horn right in the middle. So, right, plowing right through. So the large horn of the goat is suddenly broken at the height of its power. And in its place, 4 horns grew up to the heavens. Okay, history time. This is the fun part. In about 10 years, Alexander the Great had conquered the world. From the time that he first rose up at the age of 21, he was a general.
He was a general at 21?
Yep. And from 21 to 32, he had conquered the known world. Took it completely over. In 10 years, conquered the world. That's fast. Okay. So this is the empire of Alexander the Great. all the way up in Macedonia where he started. That's north of Greece. And he moved down all the way into India, parts of Russia, all the way down into Egypt. Okay, so his empire is the largest empire to date as far as landmass that he took over. So Alexander's conquering of most of the known world sets up the common language, his language, which was Koine Greek. The whole world spoke Koine Greek after he took it over. Koine, Koine.
Different than Greek today.
It's different than Greek today. But Koine Greek is the language of the New Testament. So this became and remained the language of trade up until the Middle Ages, like 1000 AD. Okay, it wasn't until the Catholic Church, the Holy Roman Empire, took over that it changed to Latin. Okay, it was Koine Greek. This was the language of trade. It was the common language of people in their homes, and it was instrumental in spreading the gospel. Any new region you go to, as long as it was one time in the Greek Empire, they're going to understand you bringing this message about Jesus Christ. And it's God putting the chess pieces in place thousands of years in advance of what needs to happen. In order for the gospel to spread, there had to be a common language. The common language was brought in by Alexander the Great. Okay, so this is huge.
Like, I'm just thinking spread language. Parts of his military, obviously, to.
Yeah, he
all
built-
that area.
He built the empire.
So he kept it there for-
Logistically, he would have to. Yeah.
Schools and all
Yeah.
that stuff.
Yeah, because you know how it works, like the Romans did. Every time they took over an area, they put a garrison. The garrison then would bring their families. The families then would have schools, and the schools then would also be providing healthcare. And now you got schools and healthcare, and it's going to move into the government. And it just, yeah. And so that's what's going on. Oh yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yeah. It's the currency of the empire, which is why there's still Greek coins to be found today. So many that was spread throughout the known world.
Saw a lot to the museum. There was a lot of.
Yep.
coins.
Yep. But
Yeah, he does.
at the age of 32, he dies. And it's been shrouded in mystery because they didn't have forensics back then, didn't have a medical examiner, couldn't do the lab work to figure out. But based on the historic symptoms that he had leading up to 2 weeks before, and then at the time of his death, they suspect it was typhoid. It was COVID-19. Yeah. Yeah. All right, so he died of suspected typhoid. There's been a discussion of the cause of his death, including a myriad of diseases. It's only recently that it was changed to typhoid. Before that, it was typhus. Before that, it was malaria. And they were trying to put together where he was battling in swamps before this time. Oh, it's like all kinds of stuff. It's a bug disease. So it was even several poisons from rivals that were in contention for cause of death here. Decomposition started very quickly. Within 6 days, they said that he was, he was badly decomposed. So at this point, his body was preserved in a vat of honey in order to preserve it for transport, because they needed to get it back home. He died in Babylon. Okay, that was the center of the empire at the time. So he died in Babylon, and he was supposed to be transported back to Macedonia, which is where he was born. One of his generals rerouted the body to be buried in Memphis, Egypt. So southern part of the kingdom. In early 3rd century BC, he was exhumed and then reburied in Alexandria, Egypt, on the coast, where the great library of Alexandria was. His final resting place is not known for sure, and some suspect it is in a crypt under an early Christian church. But
In what
it's,
century?
yeah, it's
Oh.
fallen into mystery. It's one of those great searches for Alexander. We just, yeah, we just don't know. Don't know. Okay. So the 4 kingdoms that came after the death of Alexander the Great were a result of Alexander's generals. He had 4 branches of his army being led by these generals, and they became his successors. So it wasn't a royal succession because, or a governmental succession, because he was still in conquering mode. It wasn't ruling mode. And so he was still taking over the world. Different generals got control over different parts of the empire. One general in particular, Ptolemy I Soter, got control over Egypt, and he founded the Ptolemaic kingdom. Cleopatra came out of the Ptolemaic kingdom. Okay, so there's players even into the Roman Empire that come from this. Another general, Cassander, had control over mainland Greece. Lysimachus was one of Alexander's bodyguards and also a member of the companion cavalry. He got control over Thrace and Asia Minor. Last but not least, Seleucus I Nicator was one of Alexander's generals, and he got control over the Middle East and Central Asia, and he by far had control over the most amount of land. So this is a picture of what they call the Diadochi, which is the names of the way that these 4 generals ruled. And it split up Alexander's great empire. Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and then Ptolemy. Now the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, they continued fighting for land because Ptolemy saw the same thing Stacy did. The Seleucids got a lot of property. They don't deserve all that. And so they were always fighting over property. The problem is that it wasn't just property that the Seleucids held. It was also people and soldiers. And so the Seleucids were much more powerful than the Ptolemies, which is why Egypt basically got squished down into a very small area by the time modern history came in.
Let's start making these maps. Page.
Go back to page size. All right, now check this out, verse 9. Out of one of them, the broken horn, came another horn, which started small, but it grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land, which is the promised land. Okay. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry hosts down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Sounds like we took another turn. And what is this pointing to? This is starting to point to our future stuff. But again, because this is twice fulfilled prophecy, we got to have some near history that it takes care of. Yeah, from the east, actually. So this was fulfilled in one of the 4 successors to Alexander the Great. Since the dominion of this horn was extended towards the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land, we can identify the historic fulfillment of this little horn as Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who ruled over Syria and Israel's land under the Seleucid dynasty. So this is the Seleucid heir. So now we're about 200 BC, 150 BC in time. And what happens now is we've got a ruler that comes out of the Seleucid Empire that's going into for conquest. An heir by conquest. Because now we're not kings passing to sons anymore. We're conquerors passing conquerors. Okay.
You conquer and become king.
Yeah. So that's what's going on. So Israel's land has always been at the center of a mess. As it is today, it always has been. And it was no different during the time of the Ptolemies, which were in control of Egypt, and the Seleucids, which were in charge of all the Middle East. And the meeting ground, halfway in between, was always Israel. Israel was always a battleground. Whether they wanted to conquer Israel or not, no, usually they didn't, because there wasn't much of anything left. After the Babylonian Empire and the Persian Empire, there wasn't anything left to take. It was all taken. It was desert with a river valley that was fertile. So you water your horses and then you keep on fighting. That's all there was. But Israel was a battleground. So it was contested land between the dynasties, but the Seleucids gained power over the region in the days of Antiochus III, which actually was Antiochus IV's father. Antiochus IV gained the throne of his father by murdering his brother, the former king Seleucus Philopator. The son of Philopator was the rightful heir to the throne, but Antiochus IV had him held hostage in Rome. Antiochus IV legitimized his rule mainly through flattery and bribery. Antiochus IV assumed the title Epiphanes. He gave that title to himself, meaning illustrious. Okay, so he's Antiochus the Illustrious. And he alluded to deity in this word. The ancient Jews twisted the name from Epiphanes to Epimanes, which means madman. So he became Antiochus Epimanes instead of Epiphanes. So Antiochus Epiphanes exerted his dominion toward the south, toward the east, and toward the land of Israel. That's what history says. Antiochus Epiphanes murdered other rulers, persecuted the people of Israel. He cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them, is what Daniel said. Okay. Antiochus Epiphanes blasphemed God and commanded idolatrous worship directed toward himself. He actually exalted himself as high as the prince of the host.
He said that about himself?
Yes. Antiochus Epiphanes put a stop to the temple sacrifices in Jerusalem. Daniel said by him the daily sacrifices were taken away. So Antiochus is doing everything that was prophesied. Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple. Daniel says the place of God's sanctuary was cast down. Antiochus took care of that. Antiochus Epiphanes opposed God and seemed to prosper. According to Daniel's prophecy, it says he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered.
When was Daniel saying this and when did this happen?
So Daniel was saying this at 500 BC, 532, and this is like 180.
Near future for that.
Then
And
bring
then
it
we're gonna catch the Antichrist as our far future.
Right. That's the second fulfillment. Okay. So scholars are almost in unanimous agreement that Daniel's talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. No doubt about it. Antiochus IV gave himself this title Epiphanes. He's a madman. Why? Because of what he did in Jerusalem. So basically, he was mad because he got beat in a battle. He was north of Jerusalem in an area now that's Lebanon. And he got beat in this battle. He's mad. And so he's heading south to go back to Egypt. And on the way, he finds unsuspecting Jerusalem, a bunch of sheep herders doing nothing. And he basically comes in and devastates them. And he goes into the temple, which they're still trying to have church there. And he says, no, you're worshiping me from now on. And so he goes in there, he replaces the high priest in Jerusalem with a man of his own choosing. He savagely attacks Jerusalem, executing tens of thousands, men, women, and children, in the city. The temple was left without daily sacrifices. Religious practices became non existent, and a statue of Zeus was placed in the temple. Human sacrifices are now being made on the idol, on the altar. Circumcisions forbidden. Unclean meat was mandatory fare for all people, and the Sabbath and other feast days are now prohibited. Basically, as a conqueror, he dismantled the entire Jewish world. Okay. Before he replaced the high priest, he bound him, sacrificed a pig, and the juices that flowed off of the altar, he drowned the priest in them. Okay, so I mean, this guy was brutal, and it's all because he didn't get his way. All right, madman. So the host and stars are symbols used in the Old Testament, not only for angels, but also for kings and leaders or the people of God in general. So anybody that follows God's will and follows God's plan as a group, they're part of the starry host in the Old Testament. Okay. And it says that he trampled on them. So Antiochus's suppression of the Jews came to a head in December of 168 BC. He returned in defeat and going to Alexandria. I wrote that wrong. He ordered his generals to seize Jerusalem on a Sabbath. There he set up an idol of Zeus and desecrated the altar by offering of swine, sprinkling the pig's juices all over the sanctuary, and sacrifice stopped because the temple was desecrated. The Maccabees, 3 books that are apocryphal books. Great for history, though. It gives us some details. First Maccabees 129. And after 2 years fully expired, the king sent his chief collector of tribute unto the city of Judea, who came into Jerusalem with a great multitude, spake peaceable words unto them, but all was deceit. For when they had given him credence, he fell suddenly upon the city, and smote it very sore, and destroyed much people of Israel. And when he had taken the spoils of the city, he set it on fire, and pulled down the houses and the walls thereof on every side. But the women and children took they captive, and possessed the cattle. Then it continues, then many of the people were gathered unto them, to wit, every one that forsook the law, and so they committed evils in the land, and drove the Israelites into secret places, even wheresoever they could flee for succor. Now, the 15th day of the month, Caslu, in the 140 and 5th year, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar. We see that again in Revelation. And builded idol altars throughout the cities of Judea on every side, and burnt incense at the door of their houses and the streets. And when they had torn in pieces the books of the law which they found, they burnt them with fire. And whosoever was found with any book of the testament, or if they committed to the law, the king's commandment was that they should put him to death. Thus they did by their authority unto the Israelites every month, to as many as were found in the cities. It's estimated that he murdered 100,000 people.
Are you saying, it says Judah, are you saying, you're saying Judea? Is that
Judea is the whole Israel land. Judah, Israel. Israel's where Jerusalem is, but it's not a kingdom anymore. Now on the 25th day of the month, they did sacrifice upon the idol altar, which was upon the altar of God, at which time, according to the commandment, they put to death certain women that had caused their children to be circumcised. Remember, circumcision's forbidden. And they hanged the infants about their necks and rifled their houses and slew them that had circumcised them. Moreover, King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and everyone should leave his laws. So all the heathen agreed, according to the commandment of the king. Yea, many also of the Israelites consented to his religion, and sacrificed unto idols, and profaned the Sabbath. For the king had sent letters by messenger unto Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, that they should follow the strange laws of the land, and forbid burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offerings in the temple, and that they should profane the Sabbaths and festival days, and pollute the sanctuary and holy people, set up altars and groves and chapels of idols, and sacrifice swine's flesh and unclean beasts, that they should also leave their children uncircumcised, and make their souls abominable with all manner of uncleanness and profanation, to the end they might forget the law and change all the ordinances. And whoever would not do according to the commandment of the king, he said he should die. So in Daniel 8:12, because of the rebellion, the Lord's people in the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. That's the prophecy. But as we see in Maccabees, which is a historic account after the fact, so the Maccabees were written between 400 BC and 100 BC as a collection of books. Of course, this is going to be later because it was after Antiochus did all of this stuff, right? The Maccabees, we don't know. It's not a Bible book. It's an apocryphal book. It's good for history, but one of the reasons it didn't make it into the Bible is that the author did not name himself. And he said, I am writing this down as it was told to me by another. And so because it wasn't firsthand account, it doesn't make the grade, and it's not in the Bible. The Catholic Bibles have it. Okay, so everybody who leaves the Catholic Church can come back for the rest of the story. That was the slogan when after the Reformation.
But are Maccabees a group of people?
It's a group of people led by Judas Maccabeus. And Judas Maccabeus was basically a guerrilla warfare trying to dismantle the Roman Empire by executing everybody that he could find in lightning blitzkrieg type attacks. So that's a cool story all on its own. Cool stuff. So the first attack of Antiochus against the Jews was to settle a rivalry for the office of high priest. A pious high priest, Anias III, was removed from office and replaced with his brother Jason, because Jason bribed Antiochus for the position. Then in 172 BC, another brother, Menelaus, gave Antiochus an even bigger bribe and replaced Jason. A year later, Menelaus started selling many of the temple's gold utensils to raise money to pay off the bribe. Anias III rebuked him, and Menelaus had him murdered. Meanwhile, Jason gathered armies and fought against Menelaus to regain the office of the high priest. Antiochus Epiphanes came into Jerusalem 171 BC to defend the man who paid him a bigger bribe to be the high priest. So, yeah, so Israel at this point was already corrupt, like totally corrupt. And so I would say that God used Antiochus to basically wipe it clean, and there wasn't anything left. Yeah, so there's this idea that you're going to hear again and again and again that's called the diaspora. So anytime a great conquest happened to Israel, there are people that made it out, and they continued the ways of God. And then when things settle down, they move back in to reestablish what they had lost. And this happens again and again and again, as late as 1947, when the United Nations says, Israel, you have your homeland. You're a nation. And all of the Jews from around the world came back and settled. And in fulfillment of prophecy, a nation was born in a day.
Now, seems like a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. But they took out all the corrupt leadership. They destroyed most of the word of God. But there is always scrolls that are with the remnant, and the remnant reestablished the worship. And the Romans, when they take over after Greece, they realize we need to keep the people happy, so we need to give them a semblance of their religion. And so they allow Herod, King Herod, we know him from Jesus' times, right? They allow King Herod to actually rebuild the temple. That's the second temple. And when he rebuilds it, it's a mere shadow of what Solomon's temple was. And they reestablish the altar, clean everything, and they consecrate everything. And by Jesus's time, they're worshiping in the temple again. Okay. So all of this happens 150 years before Jesus. But by Jesus's time, it's all put together again. So those that are saying that, I'm getting into the end time stuff. There are those that say the Antiochus was actually the Antichrist that was prophesied. But that's not true, because it didn't finish the way the Revelation finished. And they had worship again until it was desecrated again in 70 AD. So yeah. I went long, even in 12 verses, and I still went long. I didn't even look at my watch. All right. So that's all I've got for you today.
So the Hebrew and the numbers, that interests you, we're gonna have a class on the 28th here on Saturday. From 9 to 1. To be Hebrew alphabet and the explanation of all the numbers and how they line up. And
Unfortunately, I'll be on my way to Hawaii. Okay. And I already teach that stuff. So yeah. Yeah. We said Saturday. Oh. Yeah. That'll be Fiji. Yeah. All right, y'all. That's all I've got for you. Gary, we'll see you next time. Hopefully I'll be broadcasting from the ship next Sunday. Yeah, actually, I'm going to be,
He's gonna keep his phone in Texas.
yeah, I'm gonna put my phone in Texas, so I'll know what time it is. It's gonna be earlier. On the ship, I'll probably be 2 hours earlier than y'all next Sunday. Yeah. Now, by the time we get to Fiji, I'll be doing it on Saturday night. Live.
They were just gonna print the stuff beforehand.
I don't know how all that's gonna work yet. I don't know. So if I do, I will make it somebody's responsibility to print it out. But I don't know how all that's gonna work yet. It's all a big unknown.
Maybe Kenny's.
Yeah, like he doesn't have enough to do already.